You can't build reform upon decay, so we must start this educational system, as you have attempted in your own school, from a new source, and one of compassion and wholeness, not this fragmentation, this emotional fragmentation.
It is really very pleasant to come to my school. It's a nice atmosphere. I remember once there were in the exams, they have to take general exams. They pass because they get general education there, and very good too. As I said before, I believe some of them get scholarships even to universities, Cambridge. But at one term, there were 10 and 11-year-olds who they were the first subjects in which they excelled. One was Hebrew. Well, that was natural because he was an Israeli boy. And the other was astronomy. The boy had made his own telescope. And but that's, of course, the kind of school that every school should be. But then you come up against situations, teachers, conditions. I've always said that teachers shouldn't begin by teaching from a book. They should begin by showing and giving an example, and teaching, even if they learn the subject the day before, the next chapter, they should speak to the children and look at them in the eye and get a response from them and speak with imagination. Trouble with teachers, again, is that they teach the same subject year in, year out from the same books.
The same routine, the same fear, the same respectability. They don't want to lose the job. They stay on for their tenure, and they're bored. They've become limited. They bore the children. They're frightened. They see themselves growing old. The children always remain the same age.
We have had very good response with ESTA, European String Teachers Association. That was formed some years ago, and the English String Teachers Association, I was for many years, it's only existed about 7 years. I was the president, still am, and now have become the president of the European String Teachers Association. But in England we have 1,000 members. These string teachers used to be isolated, lost individuals who would be treated as the orphans of educational institutions. The itinerant teachers would come and be given perhaps a corridor in a school to teach in, or relegated to the kitchen when not in use. And they had no contact between each other, the peripatetic teachers and others. Now they meet not only once a year generally, but in small groups throughout the year. We have, I think, one of the best publications in the world, because it only contains interesting and good news to string teachers. It's very small, very cheap, just a few pages, and contains interesting articles on music, on interpretation, on violin playing, on cello studies, on the difficulty of how to go about vibrato and what about octaves, and I don't know what, but always useful. And there is no pornography in it. There is no sensationalism. There is... it's a good little thing.
But they're thrilled when they get it.
And there's a lot of humor. And I cannot tell you what a difference that's made to string playing in England.
Oh, that's incredible. Small things can become miracles. A few pages of a violin discussion coming to these 1,000 teachers who are isolated. This is what's pathetic, how many people who could love are isolated.
Yes. Yes.
Did you hear Einstein play ever?
No, unfortunately I didn't. I didn't ever play the Bach Double Concerto with him. I've played the Bach Double Concerto with nearly every likely and unlikely musician. I played it, of course, with the Queen Elizabeth of the Belgians.
Oh.
She made a point of playing it with every violinist. She studied with Isai, and so she played it with everyone. And of course I've played with him, but not, unfortunately. That's one of the unfulfilled events of my life. I never played the Bach Double with Einstein.
What a wonderful thought, just having it. Have critics in general done you more harm than good? Do they have a place? All of this journalistic...
I think critics definitely have a place. The best of them are extremely well informed, write well, and put their finger often directly on the spot. And the public needs and deserves some sort of guidance in matters, and a report. Where the critic is unable to judge is when it comes to reasons for, because they're not always capable of going into the psychology, the emotional condition, the approach of the individual. They can judge results up to a point, where they cannot judge causes.
Mm-hmm.
When they try to give a cause, they're generally totally wrong. And that's in the nature of things. As far as causing me harm or good, I think I must say that in general they've only been beneficial, not only because I probably got infinitely more good notices than bad ones, but also because I think that those that are critical might very well have a point. I am my own naturally most critical critic. I know very well, and so do most musicians, especially these days of recordings and so on. We are accustomed to hearing ourselves, just like women looking in the mirror are well aware of all their blemishes, and so does a musician hearing his recording well aware of all his weaknesses. And I think that the critic, if he's honest, if he isn't seeking either to show off himself or to demolish, I think where the critic can be of crucial importance may be in judging a debut recital. Even then, I mean, there may be other chances, but that's where it counts for most.
Yes.
Where the public doesn't yet know the artist, and where the critic may have the opportunity either of enhancing a career, pushing it on, giving how shall I say, confidence, or perhaps rightly saying the artist isn't ready yet.
Confidence is wonderful, and encouragement is, of course, the best thing any teacher can ever give to a student.
Yes. On the other hand, you cannot encourage something which is on the wrong track.
Yes.
Or something
that happens with much teaching.
Yes. The
teacher should have the responsibility to.
Yes. I know that I'm generally not inclined to be, how shall I say, ruthless or hard. But when I feel that I'm put in a position when no one else is going to say the truth, then I've got to say that. I mean, I've many times young people come and play. I'm all for their pursuing music, but not necessarily as a profession.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's much more important really to love music and then do something else and keep on playing and using it as an amateur would use it. That is by far the nicest use of music anyway. This wonderful Leventrit, you remember Edgar Leventrit, who was one of the greatest friends of all musicians, wonderful man, my first lawyer, the man who drew up, well, my second lawyer, the first was Sidney Irwin in San Francisco, who recommended Leventrit, who drew up my first contract with Evans and Salter.
Now that man in San Francisco was certainly an extraordinary,
wasn't he?
Living
Yes.
to 102.
Yes,
right?
Wonderful man, wonderful, noble
Disinterested
man.
gallantry.
Yes, absolutely. Sidney Irwin, Uncle Sidney, one of the great, great people I knew. I was very lucky in my life because I've known a good many great men, great women. I'm great not in the sense of necessarily being known,
Sure.
but of being intrinsically, inherently great people. And they have come in the guise of the poorest people as well.
Being anonymous is a wonderful thing.
Yes. Well, gifts should in fact be anonymous. It's the opposite of the. I don't think Israel would have proceeded as far as it has become on anonymous gifts.
Yes.
I don't think it would have got very far.
You know, you had extraordinary nurturing, Mr. Menuhin, from your
Yes.
parents, and it seemed that any time you really needed something to happen, life would just come to you and make it happen.
It is extraordinary when I consider how very, very lucky I have been. At every moment, my timing, in the sense that I didn't. My only merit is that I have not tried to command time, but I have never missed time. I mean, when something came, whether it was Ravi Shankar or Grappelli, and they only came because Diane and I went to India because we wanted to get to know India, and were invited there. The best things happen by chance, not as a result of direct effort, but as third and fourth repercussions of taking advantage of an opportunity through curiosity, love, and desire to understand. It's not by going directly after the thing. That doesn't lead very far.
No.
The shortest,
and it becomes boring.
The shortest way I've always found is the longest way in time, and the longest way is by far the most interesting, rewarding, and shorter.
Yes. Because the goal itself.
It's the way there.
Yeah.
It's what you learn on the way.
Yeah.
And if you are given, as a young man, if you were given all the wealth in the world and the fame, and didn't know anything about it, it would be suicidal. It would be a mortal gift, really.
Yes.
Yes.
If so, you had this nurturing, and it was wonderful. And if you needed a violin, it would come to you. I think it's because you could seize life in the moment always.
Yes. And then I was born perhaps in a period when gifts like Henry Goldman here in New York, they were not taxable. There were people's consciences were not attached to foundations which were tax deductible. There was still what I'm trying to bring back into life in England and here, this spontaneous mutual aid, which we've been talking about before, which when Goldman was blind, he was very wealthy, and when he told me the day that he invited my father and me, through the intercession of Dr. Garbett at the time, who was his personal doctor and ours, that I may choose any violin I wanted. Well, it was one of the greatest days in my life. And I chose the Khebenhüller from Emil Hermann, and he paid at that time I think $55,000 for it, which was a great amount of money in those days. I could have chosen the Betz, which at that time was going for near $100,000, which is now in the Library of Congress. But I chose the Khebenhüller, not only out of modesty, but because I loved the Khebenhüller.
No, I don't think you would have just chosen out of modesty. I think that I think you were very in touch with the fact that you wanted this violin.
Yes.
And I think you're always in touch with what you need.
Yes. Well, when you think that I chose my teachers, when I was 3, my parents took me in San Francisco to the concerts, orchestral concerts, and I said the leader, the concertmaster, Persinger, I wanted him as a teacher.
Amazing. Those stories are they're so amazing because this again is part of this seizing what you needed. If it was Enesco or going to Europe the first time, did this come about mostly from your mother, who seemed to have this passionate quality?
And at the same time, a kind of trust in her son, that his instincts, and they were glad to follow up on them. They encouraged and channeled them, but at the same time I had the initiative. I chose Enesco when he appeared in San Francisco as a soloist.
You knew instantly.
I knew the man I loved and was fired by. And the same way I chose my wife.
Yes.
In London.
Goddess of the Hunt.
Huh?
Goddess of the Hunt?
Yes, Goddess of the Hunt. And by the way, she's just written her book, which is coming out in St. Martin's Press in a few weeks. It's come out in England already. You know what she called it?
Yes.
Yes.
What? No, I don't.
No?
What is the title?
Fiddler's Moll.
Oh, my goodness. How did the word fiddle come about, really?
Well, it's a German word, a perfectly respectable word, Fiedel. Fiedel, which was the folk fiddle, and it's come through the Anglo-Saxon fiddle, whereas violin has come from the Latin. I mean, the English language is as rich as it is because it's drawn both on the Latin and the Anglo-Saxon, and on the Greek as well.
We spoke of this nurturing that you had. Do you think that, and this is a conception many people have, that, if you really have this talent, it will win out? I don't necessarily think so. I think you have to have many things happening
you have to have
right.
Many things. When you think of the number of... I believe that every child is talented. And in fact, when I started my school, it wasn't at all with the idea of picking out so-called geniuses, which very few are. Yes, perhaps the children at 7 who can beat the chess masters.
Goethe said they're all geniuses, all children, until they go to school at 6.
That's right. And our children had perfect teeth without any holes until they went to school.
Mm-hmm.
So geniuses and good teeth, they go together.
I'm going to ask you this question on religion. In today's world, it seems more violent than ever before. Did you ever think Islam would rise again? As you were growing up in San Francisco in the 30s, did you think Islam was anything other than a piece by Balakirev?
It is an amazing phenomenon, this fanatical fundamentalism. We have seen certain revivalist movements. I think there was a rather strong fundamentalist movement in the South here at one time. But Islam has been torn apart for so long, its different tribes, originally tribes, its different branches, and somehow or other in that Middle Eastern area, I don't know whether it's geographical or whether it's the desert, it breeds a kind of fanaticism, religious fanaticism. It breeds religion, for one thing, because I think there's a very nice tract of Freud on monotheism and the desert, on how somehow that... Yes, this tract of Freud, Sigmund Freud, on monotheism and the relation of monotheism to the desert. And he seems to feel that the unity of the space, the simplicity of the desert, unbroken by trees or mountains or anything, led perhaps to the first thought of monotheism, whereas in the countryside that would be broken by many different shades of green and many different types of vegetation and geographical sites, that perhaps people would be more like the Greek coastline and Greece itself, which is so full of little valleys and individual cultures that have sprung up specifically in various little regions that may have led to a diversity of gods. But the one thing about the Middle East is that this tribal relationship of one group of people to the other is so strong. Both the loyalties are within the tribe are immense, and the rivalries and the conflicts are also very great. It is a militant religion, certainly Mohammedanism, and yet if you read the Sufi books at its highest, it is as noble, as wise, as tolerant as the greatest religions in the world, as Judaism or Christianity or Buddhism. It is as philosophical. Some of my favorite readings are Sufi stories and anecdotes, and they're absolutely unbelievable, so that it does live at the very height. But this is a kind of surrender, shall we say, again perhaps to frustration and to the desire for recapturing a very great culture, a very great empire that extended at the time from Gibraltar to Indonesia. Throughout that whole band went through India and to Indonesia, of which now only remnants are left. Bali, by the way, is Hindu. It's not Mohammedan, Indian. But this is an atavism, and somehow also a return to simplicity. It's the mental requirements for today's survival are such that the temptation of black and white as in Germany. Even this great country of Germany succumbed to black and white. The simplicity of saying this is good, this is bad. And we must understand, too, that we have given the Mohammedans, we've given the Islam certain valuable grounds for them for resentment. Whether this would have come about, whether Iran would have come about with or without the Shah, I really don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly things are worse in Iran now than they've ever been under the Shah. To be at the mercy of people who think they are infallible and who have absolute power is one of the curses of humanity. And that we must never look upon a situation with a sense of superiority. I mean, the fact that we are in no ways comparable to Iran, that we are not under the leadership of an Ayatollah with extreme powers, and the sense of the righteousness of the Quran,
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean that we aren't in some degree in danger of this black and white mentality that still is a dangerous temptation for people who are tired of having to weigh subtle differences and who are not prepared to do that and don't have the time to do that and want to get on and say, well, give it to a dictator, let him decide, let's have order. Well, for instance, the whole business of discussing order. Again, is order something you can impose, or does it have to grow? Shouldn't it grow from within the person through self-discipline and so on? It's a very difficult ordeal. When you think of what these people have to suffer, that we have gone through hundreds of years trying precisely to protect people from the arbitrary, from laws that condemned before judging. We are protected by these hundreds of years of British history.
From the Magna Carta down.
Magna Carta down, and we have inherited that. We have built our own laws in the same spirit. And there we see today the rise, first in Hitler, before that already in Lenin, but now in many dictators coming up, some of the most brutal as Amin and Bokassa, upstarts with not even a Quran to draw upon. And
Yes.
then someone who feels saintly and has the conviction of righteousness and infallibility, like the Ayatollah, with apparently no humility. These are modern dangers that are on all sides threatening us. This mentality, I don't think we are in danger of that kind of fundamentalism here. We're far too advanced in the electronic, scientific, self-critical, because when you are dealing with studies in nature, there is an element there that keeps you, after all, to a certain truth. I mean, you cannot pretend any longer that the earth is flat, for instance. You cannot pretend that there are less than so and so many elements. You cannot pretend that there are less than so and so many speeds. Therefore, you're dealing already with relativity. As we are beyond the point when we can fall back, I think, into the pure black and white, because from Einstein on, and presumably from before him, Galileo and others, we have already embraced the relativity of everything, of speeds and of weights and of gravity and so on. But before there was proof, before the world had proof of this relativity, energy and mass and believers and non-believers and nationals and aliens, they were black and white.
Mm-hmm.
They were black and white. And I think Islam is precisely an example of a country and a people that hadn't yet bridged that enormous gap between between a society that was still what is the word when everything is determined by a religious edict? I can't think of it. As the Jewish society was. In other words, when you bathe, how you bathe, what you eat, when you rise, how you make love to your wife. I mean, everything was a theocracy is what I'm talking about.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So that Iran never evolved sufficiently to shake off all the heritage of a theocracy.
Yes.
And Israel has. I don't think there's any danger of Israel being a theocracy, despite the efforts
with
of
all the different blood.
Totally different blood, mixed blood all over the world.
Yes.
It's the most mixed blood in the world.
Yes.
Therefore, the heaven for doctors.
You once said that now, that they will possibly now suffer from being a nationality.
Yes.
And
well,
that's more horrible now than anything.
Yes. It has to pass through that phase.
Can it, though, without
can it go beyond
more
that?
war of such magnitude that it can create a...
I think there are very... I mean, that demonstration in Jerusalem, there wasn't 500,000 people who were criticizing the Lebanon adventure. That, I think, is an indication of at least a very large body of opinion in Israel that's thinking of not only of immediate self-defense, which is justified, but of ultimate cooperation. I think unless you keep that ideal in front of the people and repeat it every day, unless you say that what we want is to be a people among our neighbors and to give them the same feeling that we have achieved and to treat them as equals, and so on, unless that is repeated every day, then the other will get the upper hand. This fear, which is justified up to a point, it is justified. They are surrounded by enemies, but to a certain extent they've contributed to this attitude, and to the extent that it's at all humanly possible to project an ideal society, it should be done. It's one of the most tragic. The history of Jerusalem is one of the most tragic histories of any city in the world. Jerusalem has been sacked more often than any other city, and it has been sacked each time it was seized as the exclusive property of anyone.
Again, that exclusive.
And I'm afraid, of course, Teddy Kollek is one of the most enlightened men in the world, and he seeks to make it equally available to all the different elements, to the different churches, to the Arabs, and the clinics are for both, and he does his very level best, and he's a wonderful man. But I think it should be possible for that, even if it's impossible to do now, just to say that one day we hope that it will be regarded with equal veneration by all those who find their origins in here, their religious origins, here are holy parts. It can be worked out. I once drew up a plan for Jerusalem and sent it to Teddy Kollek. But it's a perfectly workable plan, only it's impossible. It's too early, it's too soon.
Well, that too soon always frightens me, you know.
Yes.
Because it has to be now.
I know, but what will you do with people who, quite understandably, have looked to Jerusalem as their haven, their home for thousands of years, finally have it, love it, respect it, make the most of it, and don't want to share that power over Jerusalem with anybody else. And the others who, if only they found a few with whom they could share it, that would be already a beginning, or just the promise that eventually it will be a. But they are quite right. I mean, no universal power can administer Jerusalem as well as it's administered today.
Mm-hmm.
The United Nations can't do it. The Arabs can't do it. The Arabs and the Jews can't do it together, because the Arabs who did it would be assassinated by their own people. The Jews can't do it because it's difficult for them emotionally to share that holy, sacred place. And therefore, it cannot happen today. But if only, I would already be grateful. For instance, when there was a bomb was thrown by a Jewish fanatic at an Arab bus the other day. I was in Jerusalem with Dan at the time, on a Sunday, and the president, we met him in the afternoon, then he came to the concert just after this had happened. We spoke about it. He's a wonderful man, an Irishman, Herzog, and whose father was chief rabbi in Ireland. Most charming man. And I said, but these were Israeli Arabs. They were assassinated by a Jewish fanatic. Here is an opportunity to declare a day of mourning in Jerusalem, just to give an example of impartiality.
Yes.
How I feel. Of course, they never did it.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel that probably they couldn't have done it. Maybe the president would have been assassinated. I just don't know.
Did you ever think that your dear friend Indira Gandhi would be killed by a terrorist religious group?
No. But then look at what happened to Gandhi himself.
Yes.
And everybody has firearms today. The ability to annihilate today is greater than ever, not only on a grand scale but on a small scale. Everybody owns guns. There are manuals on how to destroy authority and governments. There are manuals how to make revolutions. There are manuals how to make homemade bombs. And there are schools. Guerrillas are being taught in international schools today.
So what chance is there for survival?
Well, I think we have, up to a certain point, we cannot answer them with the same treatment. We must be absolutely push our defenses as far as possible, but we must leave doors open for redemption, for even the guerrillas. Because, after all, Begin was a guerrilla in his day, and he's become quite respectable. And I feel, too, that...
But I'm also frightened of respectability.
Oh, yes, that's true. But nonetheless, the element of fighting outside the confines of the establishment, of the established state, is something that has spurred the imagination of many people. One of the Three Grenadiers, or those who defy the state. We've had a tradition of that in this country.
Yes.
A very great tradition of lawlessness.
Thoreau.
The rogue.
Thoreau himself.
Yes, exactly.
Sure.
So we admire that underneath in some of our accepted respectabilities.
But this fanaticism is not just romantic rebellion that we really admire. There's no romanticism in killing.
No, there's no romanticism. But I'm not at all sure that some recognition of Arafat would be out of place. I'm not at all sure. It's very difficult. But he seems to be relatively more moderate than the others.
Yes.
And would we then deal more readily with a fanatical state that would come up in its stead? I mean, that's a question.
That's a great question. You've had a fierce involvement with Russia. You were the first American musician to perform there after World War II. You had lots of adventures there, to say the least. You knew Oistrakh. He gave you the Shostakovich manuscript
Yes.
of the violin concerto. You have been there often, and it's a complex nation. I know the...
You said it.
Yes. I know the Armenians said the Turks kill the body, but the Russians kill the soul.
It's difficult to say. Certainly the soul is very deep in Russia, and it's very difficult to kill that soul. What they have killed largely in the population is the joie de vivre, which the Russians used to have. This kind of reckless, total abandon, which even in 1945, at the end of the war, there was such relief that the war was over, despite the huge, huge casualties, despite the fact there was nothing to eat. But the hope for a new world, for a world which would embrace each other, was so great that there were a few euphoric weeks. I happened to be in Moscow during those euphoric weeks. And it was an extraordinary feeling. Walking the streets of Moscow at night, going to gypsy theaters with my colleagues.
Nothing but caviar and what else?
Oh, yes, they had nothing to eat there. But so I said, well, they said, we can offer you no white bread. And I said, I don't want white bread. I love black bread. And I said, I'll be satisfied with three things: sour milk, black bread, and caviar. And in those days, the caviar was still very, very good. And that was my diet for the 10 days I was there. I never felt better in my life.
Well, you loved being there.
I did. I felt my Russia. I felt the Russia of my ancestors, in a sense. And I feel very Russian in terms of emotion, of even interpretation. I mean, Oistrakh and I were very close to each other in that respect. There was something, apart from the intellectual, something gut Russian about it. And I would feel totally at home with the Russians were it a differently administered country.
And what an administered country. We can get into the Solzhenitsyn in a second, but I also want to ask you this. You said that for the Russian Jew, the mother city being Odessa, and it's your grandmother city, the violin was the passport, the purse, and path to the summits of society. In the American, more assimilated Jew, you have no violin anymore, really. It's too difficult to work that hard to play the violin for an American. There's been this great switch, though, to this literature going worldwide to Asians.
Yes, exactly. I think the parallel to the Jew in Russia was the Negro in the United States. And this being an advanced country, it was his African rhythms and his voice and, of course, the piano. The black pianists, jazz pianists, are some of the great American achievements.
Absolutely, and of course the ragtime that was before that with Scott Joplin, and he was a pianist in the whorehouses.
Yes.
And of course he was called, and I just love the fact that he was called, and all of his colleagues who played these not very beautiful pianos, but they played them with great expression and virtuosity, and they were called professors.
Yeah, you're speaking about the the players in the whorehouses reminds me of my dear colleague Sasha Schneider, whom I love enormously, and a wonderful musician, and with whom I played quite a lot also when we met at the Casals and festivals in Prague. And he used to tell me that he used to be very jealous of me because at the time that I made my debut in Berlin, he was playing the violin in whorehouses in Poland, which probably offered him a much more cosmopolitan experience than I ever knew.
Yes.
I'm
well,
sure
Scott Joplin, after he became domesticated and successful, he never had as much fun.
Yeah.
And let's face it, that even in misty Hamburg, where you know that Brahms is most appreciated,
Yes.
and there's certainly a statue of him there, Brahms' early life was making his living in the whorehouses too, you know.
I didn't know
Oh,
that,
absolutely.
yes.
The waterfronts of Hamburg were
Well,
his
of course,
haunts.
they're very famous for that.
Yes, and he could
Yes.
not marry really because of that. He was his libido had been so charged in a
see.
certain way by
Yes. Yeah.
by the experience, and so he would get engaged, every 4 or 5 years. And
Yes.
certainly he was in love with
Yes,
Clara Schumann,
yes,
and why
yes,
couldn't he know
yes,
her
yes,
better?
Yes. Certainly, there's no music that's more passionate and tender than Brahms.
No, but
Quite
it's not always played
central.
very tenderly and passionately. Let's talk for a moment about the man who inspired, in many ways, and wrote the cadenza for a concerto that you must have played almost as many times as the Beethoven, and that's the Brahms. Let's speak a little now on music.
Gladly.
The Brahms concerto. When I say that, what's your first moment of thought?
Well, I naturally think of Enesco, and I naturally, automatically think of the last time I played it. And if it was good as it was, I'm delighted. And that was just about a month ago in Aachen, with an Israeli conductor, David
Mm-hmm.
Yoran, excellent conductor. And I had 2 months in Bonn, producing this opera, Tito, which was a great experience, delightful experience for me. I had wonderful cooperation, glorious singers, excellent orchestra, and it was. But after the first month, and I gave 7 performances, and I couldn't resist saying I would come for the very last again on May the 14th. But I gave a few concerts. I gave this one with the Brahms concerto, which I enjoyed playing as I never had before. I played also the Bartok with Zubin.
You mean you
and
played
violin.
the concerto performance that you just recently played was the most enjoyable
The
of
most
your career?
enjoyable I've ever had, yes.
It's a
yes.
stunning comment.
Yes, I did. It probably was a last fling, I don't know, but I did love it, and I felt more at home than I ever had. So that was rather refreshing. Bonn was a pleasant experience because for 3 weeks I didn't touch the violin, and somehow I felt more at ease and enjoyed picking it up. And as I did the Bartok concerto with Zubin Mehta in Berlin a week later.
Is there some, knowing the care you have exercised in not making practicing a routine, and knowing of the great transition in your life from prodigy
Yes.
to mature artist, and readjusting your technique to a more conscious level,
Yes.
isn't there, though, some love-hate about just the practicing?
Well, I think I've overcome that. You're perfectly right that if it became a routine of so many Sefcik exercises a day, it would be. But as it's a land of discovery every day, and as I've found a way to bridge those first moments, whereby I think that is the difficulty with the violin, that between not playing it and playing it, there is a vast difference. Between not playing the piano and playing it, there's no difference at all. It's a matter of degree. I mean, you can play a note on the piano without playing the piano, and you can go from there to a few notes, and from there to a few more notes, and a little faster, and so on. What I mean by that is that you can go step by step.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the violin, I've seen children who are normally perfectly coordinated and free-moving absolutely seize up as soon as they took a violin and put it on their wherever it should go, on the collarbone. Normally it's on the shoulder, which is wrong. But anyway, so I've found ways of smoothing that path perfectly gradually, which is delightful and easy and doesn't bother me at all, and is in fact a pleasant occupation which makes me feel much better, because having played the violin all my life, it's partly almost a physiological necessity.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to the Brahms concerto, you didn't ask about the violin, you asked about the work. And Enesco was the greatest Brahms interpreter, surely.
I love that story, of course. I'm sorry to interrupt. When he made you, when you played it badly once.
Yes, here in New York, this very town.
He made you play the last movement over.
Yes, because I was doing it with Bruno Walter.
Mm-hmm.
And he came to the rehearsal. He happened to be in New York and was aghast at the speed I took the last movement. And he said, "No, that's not Brahms. You can't. Brahms, Allegro." And then when he even writes Manon Troppo, it's Allegro giocoso. It has to have a certain weight, especially as he takes the last quaver, the last eighth of the third bar, and gives it a special action. Well, that has to have its weight in its own time. I often compare these accents with physical, in the world of physical experience. That is, if you throw something into the air with a certain strength, it takes a certain time for it to come down.
Yeah.
And you can't either hurry it or change it. If you give it a certain impact, it has its own time. You cannot do yum bum bum rum pa. It's impossible. Rim bum bum rum pa, and so on. So that Enesco took me to task, and I was disappointed because the rehearsal ended at about noon, and I was going to have lunch with my favorite lady, whom I very much loved, and a young boy. She was older than I was, as it should be in that relationship. She was expecting a child, and not mine. She was married, but anyway, I said, no lunch. You're not going out. We're going over this thing. So I naturally, first things first, and I did go over it with him. And that evening he was quite happy.
Wonderful. You called him a figure of great glamour in your childhood. He had a magnetism which was.
Yes. Well, he lived music. He was the incarnation of music. Whenever he made music, it was the source. It wasn't any imitation. It was nothing learned. It was nothing. He knew music. I mean, and every kind of music. For instance, he knew all the works of Bach. I mean, he really knew them. He could sit at the piano and play them all. Because he was given the Bach Gesellschaft, volumes 60, but there was one volume missing, so that volume he didn't know. He only got 59 from the royal family who had it in their library. And he just proceeded to play through. And the extraordinary thing about Enesco is that he never forgot anything. Playing a thing through once, he remembered it for the rest of his life. That is, of course, a faculty of memory which is beyond me, beyond most people.
Or beyond my wildest thinking.
Yes. It's quite. Mozart must have had it. Mozart came back and, after hearing a performance, could sit down and play the whole thing.
The famous example at 14 when he copied out the Allegri work, and it was not allowed to ever be heard outside of this church, and they were astounded at the fact that he went home and notated the whole mass.
Extraordinary.
And with one slight error.
Extraordinary.
It's beyond belief. But Enesco was a great violinist.
He was a great violinist, and he was a natural violinist also. He studied with Hellmansberger, and of course he grew up in a Romania where the violin was played by every gypsy. And
as only they can.
As only they can, yes. They're extraordinary, the Romanian gypsies. Dinicu we know of. And but when he sat at the piano and played Tristan, you couldn't hear a better performance in any opera house in the world. And there was nothing. He loved Wagner. He adored Wagner.
And Brahms.
yes.
So there is possibilities in the world then.
Yes, it's curious.
Well, he is also an unknown composer outside of the Romanian Rhapsodies. I was listening recently to a performance by that wonderful late pianist Dinu
Dinu Lipati, yes.
who was Romanian, who Poulenc called an artist of divine spirituality.
Yes.
And there's a piano sonata number 3, which is extraordinary.
We did a string quartet of one of two, I believe, of Enesco's. That is the new Neue Zürcher string quartet with Chumachenko, who leads. Wonderful string quartet. The Zürcher are, but the work of Enesco's is unbelievable. They played it superbly. And then there are some orchestral works with choruses, one about the sea. And then
of course, the opera.
The opera,
which you call a masterwork.
Yes, it is.
But we don't get a chance to hear it.
That maybe the thing to do is to put it on a concert performance once.
Mm-hmm.
This is a great work.
So Enesco was, of course, a teacher of unbelievable inspiration. He was not a teacher. He was someone that he threw it out at you. It was a glorious experience. From the moment you ever laid eyes on him in San Francisco, you knew this was something beyond belief.
His music making on the stage in San Francisco, he conducted an octet, he played the Brahms concerto, and I think he conducted the symphony.
Mm-hmm.
But this leonine figure with a wonderful mane of black hair, standing at that time still erect, later on he succumbed to this progressive spinal curvature. He was a commanding figure of one felt such exuberance and such capacity to embrace and love and generosity. And he was in my mind when we went ostensibly as a family for me to study with Isai. Isai was already much older at the time. And
chided you for the scale.
Well, he was quite right.
How come Persinger didn't teach you the scales?
It wasn't Persinger's fault. It was my own fault.
Uh-huh.
I just didn't have patience with scales or with Persinger once wrote out most beautifully whole series of scales in thirds, which I never did. And again, I was someone who needed inspiration and went for that rather than... I would have been Carl Flesch's worst pupil.
Yes.
And probably ours too. I have the capacity of being only able to learn something that I have absorbed through my own thought. But to be told this is how a thing must be done. My wife says I'm unteachable.
That's wonderful to be uneducable.
Unteachable. Well, she's probably right. But
you have to learn it yourself.
But I can be inspired.
Mm-hmm.
I can be inspired. And that's what I found. And Isaiah was absolutely right, but he didn't inspire me as he sat, in the chair. He was crippled with one leg. And I could tell what an extraordinary musician he was, because he took his beautiful Guarneris, which I used for a time in Paris, and now is Isaac's, and accompanied the first movement of the Lalo with pizzicati, all the perfect chords and perfect rhythms and so on, quite wonderfully. I was very, very impressed with that. But then I went back to Paris with my mother, and there was a concert of Enesco's advertised, and she said, well, now here afterwards, I said, you'll come back with me and we'll ask him. No, she said, this is your show. You want him, you go and ask him yourself.
And you did.
And I did, and he agreed. Never not knowing me from Adam. I mean.
And then afterward, after working with you, there was no charge either.
No, he never charged.
See, what you had to have, you always got.
Yes. It was quite extraordinary. It was quite unbelievable, the gifts I've had of people, of their talent, of their inspiration, their knowledge.
Well, they saw something in you from the beginning that had to be nurtured and could be inspired, and you always went to the personality which was capable of the real fluid.
Yes, I suppose that I was lucky in finding the people who corresponded with my own needs.
Yeah, that's so important to understand. I want to ask you, what do you think Beethoven's relationship to the violin was? We know much more so his relationship to the piano.
Well, I think he's basically a composer for the piano, basically. And in fact, if you try, doing what is natural to a violinist, and that is sliding, glissandi, which you can even use with great discretion in Brahms, not in Bach. Bach, again, was a keyboard writer, and even in his most dramatic and most passionate, you can't really use a glissando in Bach. But no more can you in Beethoven.
Really?
Beethoven is again the keyboard. If you try sliding in any passage of Beethoven, or if you do, it must be done with such discretion that you can really hardly hear it. It's just not acceptable.
Yet pianists have often said, of course, that Beethoven is pianistically awkward. How is he violinistically? How does he feel to practice the concerto and the 10 sonatas?
They're not awkward. They're not awkward. But they're music first and violin playing later.
Yes.
They're first music. Because Beethoven, I find his music is, in a way, more symbolic than anything else. It's not, in other words, flesh and blood. It has a message each time, and by symbolic I mean that the passages are not just scales and arpeggi, which they tend to look.
They surely look like Czerny exercises on the paper.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And unless you can see them in their spiritual implication, in their symbolic implication, you've missed the point. And as such, I mean, a divine opening of the fourth piano concerto, G major chord, and yet, once you get the key to that, it's the most inspired opening of any concerto.
Yeah. And daring.
And very daring.
Yeah.
And very few pianists can play it.
It's interesting that Beethoven once, in a letter after the Hammerklavier, which he wanted to make his greatest sonata, he said, "This work will live 50 years after I die." Think of the difference now between the concept of ego in our great historical 20th century to where Beethoven was just emerging into a time where the performing art would start playing his own music. You know, not only he would be playing it, but Liszt then would play it, von Bülow would play it, Joachim would play it. It's an extraordinary thing. What is Leopold Mozart's position in the history of your instrument?
Well, he left one of the best violin manuals, guides, not only to the technique, but even to the interpretation of ornaments, grace notes, and that kind of thing. Very valuable, and obviously an extremely experienced and good musician. There's no question of that. I'm sure Leopold was essential to his son. I don't think his son would have progressed, would have been the child genius he was without his father.
Leopold gets a little bad press these days because of Amadeus.
Of Amadeus, yes. Yeah. My Diana saw the play, I saw the film in Bonn. And I must say, however distorting it may be of some historical accuracies, I found it rather moving.
Me too.
Yes.
Very much so. Many levels to think about.
Yes, yes.
Many wonderful aspects of his personality that came out.
And what's his name? Schaeffer?
Peter Schaffer, yeah.
Peter Schaffer wrote an excellent article that appeared in the London Times, and he won my heart by several things. One of them was what he said, what I felt so strongly about Titus. This work, which is all in major, and yet encompasses every possible depth of emotion and tragedy. And we can hardly, I mean, the Russian Jew can't imagine that first. I mean, it must be in minor, it must be tragic. And yet there is the difference of Mozart, who could, in the framework of perfect courtly courtesy, of always the gentle, always polite, never offending, never shocking, and yet convey the most intense passions, always in a major that apparently, if you looked at it, just as with Beethoven, you say, well, that's a series of scales and arpeggi in G major or in D major. And Mozart, you say, oh, well, these are conventional turns of phrase. What can they? You just have to go a little deeper into them, and then you realize suddenly the magic is quite unbelievable.
It is quite unbelievable. And you have played the Mozart violin concertos. Of course, you've conducted his symphonies, but are they the Mozart concertos for violin or the violin sonatas are not as close to you, I believe, as the Beethoven? Or
No,
am I wrong?
No, though I've played the all the concerti and recorded them, and there's a very nice video of the G major I made in Paris some years ago, and of the again of the G major, I think, which I did in Switzerland a little while ago. But the one of the most beautiful sonatas is this E flat major, with that glorious slow movement in A flat major. And I'm glad I'm doing Mozart Symphony in New York, the Hafner.
Now, the awesome works of Bach, those solo sonatas and partitas. Yes. Is this possible that a man wrote these for the violin?
Oh, yes.
We know it is, of course, but I mean, I'm just saying it just seems amazing.
Yes, in fact, he knew the violin very well, even though mostly there are some excursions in the faster movements to the fifth position, but mostly it's in the first position and meant to be played in the first position. In the chaconne, it goes up, of course, again to the fifth position on the bariolage over the open strings. So he knew his violin extremely well, and there's no chord that cannot be played. He never got strings or fingers mixed up. He was, I believe, himself also a violinist.
Bach knew everything.
He knew everything.
He probably heard better, if such a thing if I can say such a thing, than anyone ever heard.
Yes. He had an extraordinary sense of equally of structure as of emotional expression. You can't put Bach into a category of intellectual or mathematical or romantic, because he's all three of these.
This is a terrible question, Mr. Menuhin, but let's say you had to go to the desert island. Would you pick the 10 violin sonatas of Beethoven over the Bach solo works? Well, of course, you'd have to have a pianist with you.
You'd have to have a pianist, and it would go out of tune on a desert island. Piano is an impossible instrument on desert islands. I don't think... Well, the violin would probably come apart on a desert island. No,
We're going to keep you away from the desert island.
Yeah,
that question is meaningless.
You'd have to trust your voice or recordings. I've done desert island discs several times.
Can we speak of, in a way, the father of violin playing in Russia, Leopold Auer, who spawned Elman and Zimbalist and Milstein and Heifetz, and maybe you would just talk a little bit about these violinists.
Yes, I'd love that. I met Auer, in New York when I was a boy of 8 here.
He was born as early as 1845.
Was he 1845? Yeah. So in 1924, he would have been 69 years old. Yes, and he was wearing a skull cap, and was backstage in Carnegie Hall, not quite backstage, where the corridor goes to the backstage, just around that part. And I was introduced to him, and he greeted me. He probably vaguely heard about me. No, he had a wonderful school, and I do agree with many of the things he advocates. One of them is not to use shoulder rests. And I must say, there is a shoulder rest under my name that is not a bad one as shoulder rests go. But I do think that it's, for the most part, it's the bane of young violinists. I'd rather they used simple foam rubber in velour, coating. There are those things that adapt, because I feel the violin is such a living instrument. And it must be free not only to vibrate but to move in one's fingers. That as soon as you put a rigid or even a semi-rigid attachment to the back and then have it fill out the space, then the other thing is that it then leans on the shoulder, whereas the shoulder should be free to move. It should be on the collarbone.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I now advocate these soft shoulder rests for those who need them. And the sound that it takes away from the violin isn't that much, and you make up for it by greater flexibility. But in any case, that's just one aspect of our. It is amazing that he produced these great violinists. I think it's partly, he may have said it in jest, but it's not altogether, only partly jest, that he knew whom to choose. He also chose the best students and had them. But they were certainly quite stable when you come to think of it. Well, I was nurtured on Heifetz, Elman, and Toscher Seidel, and Zimbalist, all our pupils.
Yes.
When I was a boy in San Francisco, those were the ones, and those were the recordings I heard, particularly Heifetz's. And there was one recording of Elman's I loved, which was with Caruso, from Massenet.
The meditation, yeah. Is that it?
No. How's it go?
Oh, that.
Yes. Beautiful recording. Oh, heartrending. I loved that, as I did the Volga Boatman. But Heifetz's recordings were those I really listened to extremely carefully.
Well, they scared every violinist also.
Yes, but I was very pleased when I did the Moto Perpetua and the Dance of the Goblins.
Just as well.
Yes, pretty well. And then, of course, there was another series of recordings that were, for me, far more difficult to emulate. Those were Chrysler's. Yes. What Heifetz did, with a little time and trouble, I managed. Not knowing how, but managed.
Do you think he knew how?
Heifetz, I think he did. I think he must have had a basically wonderful schooling from our, because it's never let him down. But I think Chrysler, you see, when he played the Caprice Viennois or the Schöne Rosmarin, that was something that you can't imitate. That must come from life experience.
Yes. All of a sudden, listening, a tear just falls out of the eye, and one wonders how.
Yes. And that is something that only came. I finally mastered the Schöne Rosmarin upon return from Australia when I recorded it for the first time.
That elegance has to be in you for it to come out.
It has to be in you, but it has to be lived.
Yes.
And I was a long way from Vienna, and a long way from that kind of sophisticated life. Yes. And then I listened to that recording of Chrysler. It was the time I recorded with Hepzibah and Eisenberg the Tchaikovsky Trio. In Paris, it was 36. Yes, it was either late 35. No, it was 36. And it was in Paris. We were living at the Majestic Hotel, and I had this recording of the Schöne Rosmarin. I was determined that the time had finally come when I was just about nearly 21, that I must be able to do that, or I would really be the most backward of children or young men. And
and you were out of short pants by then.
I was out of short pants. There was no excuse not to be able to play the Schöne Rosmarin or the Caprice Viennois, and I recorded it. And the record stands up very well today. It's not.
You want to call now? 5:15.
Yes, it's 10:15.
This is very important stuff we're getting here.
Right.
You want me to take the number?
Can continue in my. I'm at peace with my.
Yes, absolutely.
Otherwise,
I understand that. Can I go? Indeed, Mr. Menuhin, you seem to be that Zen ideal where the world is moving around you, and you're understanding every aspect of what's going on, and yet there is a feeling of calm and peace. Did this come from your learning meditation?
It's misleading, you know. I'm no better than anybody else when it comes to worrying about people, about family. If my wife isn't well, if I expect her back and she isn't, or anything like that, I'm just as anxious as any other person would be. On the other hand, what isn't of immediate concern to me, naturally, like other people, I can view with a certain objectivity. Not that I don't feel for it, but at least I can see it in perspective. Diana always says that everyone around me goes into frenzies of work and occupation. Secretaries I have will work through the night for me if necessary, and they are all, and I'm the still center, perfectly quiet. It isn't absolutely true. I feel very much for those who work so hard for me, but somehow it doesn't prevent the work. It doesn't.
Wonderful. Have you read a book called Zen in the Art of Archery?
Yes, indeed, I have. I think it's a wonderful book, and actually, we do practice it up to a point in violin playing, because we don't actually see the spots that we have to hit, and we try to be as accurate as possible. But of course, it's different with an arrow, shooting it at a distance, and there every slightest angle would alter the bullseye.
Yes.
So that's much more exacting. We don't have to throw our fingers from that distance onto the fingerboard,
yes,
and hope they don't miss.
You've said that the human race is prone, I don't know if these are the words, of course, prone to blame, but the violinist, the instrumentalist up there, can blame nobody but themselves.
That is the good thing about a musician, that he must learn, and he can't avoid learning, that if he plays a note out of tune, no one else has played it. And maybe he can say, well, the string is defective. That's a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
But then he changes the string, and if the note is still out of tune, he can't say that any longer. And it's very useful, I think. And I wish that some such experience of really direct responsibility would be more generally accepted. Oh, today we had a charming example. The pilot of the Concorde. We were late 50 minutes in leaving because there was all kinds of complications. For the first time, they were sending a Concorde fully loaded with passengers to Sydney, Australia, and then we left 50 minutes late. We arrived, and when I was very anxious to arrive because I promised Diana I'd call her before 3 o'clock, and 3 o'clock was just approaching. In fact, I'd reached the telephone about 5 past, and I know how easily she worries. And the last quarter of an hour was spent standing in the corridor, that rather narrow corridor in the Concorde, waiting to disembark while the plane was moving about. And finally the captain rang and said, first he had said there was a confusion about gates. Then I suppose he felt guilty for having said that, and he said, it's entirely my fault. When we landed, I received the gate number, and I blithely sailed past it. It's entirely my fault. I thought that was rather nice.
Oh, that's well. He was working with blame on another level there. He didn't have any problems with saying that it was his fault.
No.
We were talking before about Auer and
yes,
Elman and so forth.
His bevy.
Yeah,
of
that
students.
Wonderful bevy. I was recently in a music store, and all of a sudden, for 20 cents on sale, I saw a piano suite by Zimbalist.
No.
Yes.
How interesting.
And then realized that there is also a recording out of his violin sonata. So he, like Enesco, composed, although not as well, I'm sure.
But that was the tradition.
Yeah.
It's only in our specialized world that we have begun producing. We did. Now it's coming back again. Now many violinists compose again.
And who is composing of the young violinists?
Well, I can tell you that, what's his name? Brednall, I can't remember his name, was concertmaster of one of the London orchestras, wrote a violin concerto.
Uh-huh.
And I know that all the children in my school compose. They
because they're not hindered not
no,
to.
they do. No, they're not only, but they're encouraged.
That's what I mean.
And that's right. Once, many years ago, I came to the school, and they had each composed something. Most of them, except for one or two, played their own compositions, and it was very, very interesting. I hadn't realized at all that would be so revealing of their nature, just as the pastel drawings are revealing of their nature. The same thing. The music, the little pieces they composed, were very characteristic. You know, aggressive or tender or conciliatory or dreamy or clear or whatever.
Mm-hmm. You grew up with the sound of Elman and the Russian romantic violinist, and yet you had that as part of your training, the Russian school, and then you had, in a way, the French school through Enesco.
Yes,
most Romanians always gravitated to Paris anyway.
Yes.
And
Enesco,
you had, of course, the German.
Yes,
with
Bush. It's Enesco who sent me to Bush.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he understood. Again, someone knew that you could not be one thing. You had to have all.
Yes.
Can a Russian, for instance, Mr. Menuhin, or an Italian ever be a classical violinist? In the sense of
the German, it's
yeah.
an interesting question. I mean, I grew up on Toscanini's Beethoven symphonies, which I thought were absolutely wonderful. And then I heard Furtwängler, and you see, Toscanini was a very, very great musician. He's been imitated in the superficial way, but not in the deep way.
And that's been unfortunate for music in many ways, for the performing of music.
The brilliance and the speed, but he wasn't at all that inflexible. He was much more flexible than he was inflexible at the right times with the right kind of movements. But I did have a very great variety of influences. For instance, the Le Coeur Sonata, I came to play with through Cortot, Alfred Cortot telling me. Then I knew Thibaut very well and admired his elegance and his. Then more recently, what is the name of the French pianist with whom I did all the Debussy works recorded? Can't remember. He died, unfortunately, since. Great authority on Debussy. But I've always gone to the source, as with Glenn Gould, with the Schoenberg fantasy. I couldn't have played it with anybody else, but Glenn was an authority and loved it. And I always feel somehow, as a general rule, that people who love somebody or something or some work are nearer the truth than the one who hates it.
Oh.
I have that feeling, so that if I want to know a new work, it's nice to get to know it through someone who sees the best in it.
And you can see a work for one moment in your own history, for instance. I know you haven't performed the Schoenberg Fantasy since Glenn Gould,
No.
but it was through him that you rose to this work, in a sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I couldn't have done it otherwise. The same thing with the Berg Concerto. It was Ansermet who said, you must play the Berg Concerto. Well, of course, no one knew it better than Ansermet. And so I did it with Ansermet for the first time.
Did you ever do the Stravinsky with him?
No, I did the Stravinsky, however, with Nadia Boulanger.
No kidding.
And that's pretty good, because no one knew Stravinsky better than she did.
That's right.
That was at the Festival Hall some years ago, and it's a pity it wasn't recorded. And then I knew Stravinsky. I'd met him on and off at many places, but finally I had a very close talk with him in Berlin. And his wife was there, and his
Robert Kraft? Yes.
Was there, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a great long talk in the restaurant in the Kempinski Hotel. And we were talking about the concerto, which he was very, very eager to record with me.
Really?
Yes. I was very sorry that at that moment EMI didn't feel ready to do it.
It's amazing how a little business decision, which
I
seems
know.
so insignificant, would stop such a collaboration.
Exactly. I couldn't believe it. Believe it.
Incredible.
Yes, but there we are.
America's business is business, Calvin Coolidge said, but now the world's business is business.
I know. And sometimes it stands in the way of a few